is Kibbe Conti, registered dietitian, and I think my intro was shared a little bit. I'm a member of the Oglala Lakota in Pine Ridge, and that's where I've spent most of my career in South Dakota. I am serving in Zuni, New Mexico currently. So I just want to shout out Happy Registered Dietitian Day. It is today, March 11th, and this is the day that we remember or recognize all the contribution to health and wellness that dietitians do. So I just wanted to say that, and thank everybody for joining us today. So let's get started. All right, so I guess just right off of that, let's just recommend that it's great to refer a dietitian if you're in the health practice. You don't, a doctor, of course, but other people can just refer a dietitian, recommend that's part of their care. And the nice thing about a dietitian is very personalized. We really are very thorough in looking at your medical background, looking at your eating pattern, and really tailoring a nutrition advice to help to meet your goals. So I just want to just encourage that dietitians get utilized. Sometimes I think we get a little underutilized, and we have a wealth of knowledge. We are the nutrition experts in the medical facility. Let me just get some water here. Okay, so I guess I kind of think about food and is coming from heritage foodways, and you know, we have a lot of nutrition science, and that's terrific. We can study nutrition, but really I think one of the things that we forget is that we're all here because our ancestors came from a foodway that supported a nation of people. And of course there's all different foodways, and of course across the Americas we all indigenous people come from a heritage foodway. And ironically, when we looked at our dietary guidelines, and it was, I think, Dr. Walter Willett who upheld the Mediterranean foodway as an example. And I think that's terrific because a lot of these foodways are proven to support health just by the fact that the people are still here, that sometimes these foodways are they go back many, many years. And I think there's a lot of wisdom, I guess, is what the point I'm trying to make, is that there's something about heritage foodways that we need to remember and we can learn and honor. So for our own, there we go, for our own people across Indian country, definitely we need to examine what were those foods that supported the people, and are those foods still available? And educate, and once we learn those foodways, really come up with good teaching tools like this one from the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board. I kind of collaborated on some of the materials, Feed Your DNA, and you know, choose these as healthful foods, still healthful and valuable and vital to our health and well-being. Little recipe cards are another wonderful tool. This one promotes our traditional chiaka tea, which is our wild mint tea, which is very common in northern plains. And of course, foodways tend to be regional. Foods that were available, maybe different tribes shared a similar foodway, even though they had maybe different language, but maybe their geography was similar for them to eat similarly. For Lakotas, we are soup eaters. So here's a little recipe card from our traditional stew, and that's a food that we want to keep. And let me go back to that. I just want to make sure you know that these are available, especially for the people in the northern plains. Okay. I always like to touch a little bit before I get into much education, just a little overview of our history, I guess, as Native people and the foodways that was here. So some of our original foods are beautiful. I just love these images. We have this very colorful corn and many different varieties of squashes, pumpkin, chilies, and we had beautiful foods that were domesticated by the original people. In fact, they credit the people here with actually domesticating the majority of the foods that we eat today. And here's just a little sampling, corn being a very important crop, bean varieties, potato varieties, sunflower, avocado, squashes, chilies, coffee, tomato, cocoa, strawberry, and not just strawberry, raspberry, blueberry, cranberry, pumpkin, pineapple, peanut. So many, many of the foods that we enjoy and that are part of the culinary scene were foods that were first domesticated by a Native American. And that didn't just happen. I think the reason so many of these plants got domesticated is that the people always had a relationship with the plants that they cultivated. And I guess the best example is just to quote Buffalo Bird Woman. And there's a book by that name also, Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden. She's a Hidatsa. Currently that's up in North Dakota. She says, we cared for our corn in those days just as we would care for a child. We Indian people loved our gardens just as a mother loves her children. We thought that our growing corn liked to hear us sing, just as children like to hear their mothers sing to them. So that kind of gives you an example of the relationship. It was much more deep than just growing and harvesting. There was a lot involved with the spirituality and the prayers. And you can see where the corn or the beans, through that relationship, were domesticated in many different geographic zones, arid or more humid, and so the agricultural savvy of our people is really sometimes forgotten, but there was a lot of knowledge about how to grow and harvest and to make these crops. Okay, I guess another part of that history, and maybe you've heard me share this before, but I often like to remind people the contribution that these crops made to the world. And we're going to share one little example here. Just one crop, corn, of course, corn probably being economically the most valuable crop in the world. But that didn't exist across the ocean. Corn was simply here in the North, Central, and maybe South America pre-Columbus. So I know Columbus came over here seeking, things like, gold and silver and things like that. But really the true wealth that he brought back to Europe was food like corn. And what happened is Europe had staggering famines that were really well documented. If you look in your history, you'll see that. And what came to a screeching halt was as soon as the corn came to Europe and other crops that were brought over, the famines came to an end because all of a sudden they had something to provide, supply the animals, the domesticated animals with fuel so that they have more meat, more milk, more ag products, butter, cheese, that type of thing. So the population really shifted. There was end of a famine and population explosion. The original foods, also I think our DNA is used to these foods that are more slowly releasing their fuel. The carbohydrate sources that we're looking at right here in this slide are all foods that are kind of whole foods in nature, meaning that's a whole grain. Yes, they dried the corn. Yes, they ground the corn, but still that ground corn was a whole grain. It was slowly absorbed, which kept pace with insulin production so that that fuel was utilized more easily than if we have a rush of sugar or a rush of a carb source that would spike a blood sugar. Okay, next slide. All right, so we just did a little look at shifting foods, but what about in the other way? What foods came over into the diets of Native Americans, and how did that impact their health? So in this image, this is a photo probably from maybe around the 1920s, and a lot of our ancestors, were there. They were receiving the early rations, and sometimes it was just, a couple sacks of flour, a little bit of sugar. I know green coffee beans that they'd have to roast. Some food items were distributed, but really I know at this time, if I think of my grandmother, she was still doing a lot of growing her own foods. We had our own livestock. We had our own harvesting of wild plants. And so it was still a good portion of our diet was very traditional at that time. Um, okay. Okay, so it wasn't until a little later that after World War II that we really start seeing a bigger shift in our diet. And I like to quote Harriet Kuhlman. It's widely recognized that replacing indigenous foods with a diet composed primarily of modern refined foods is at the centerpiece of the diabetes problem. And so let's take a look at that. I'm going to show a couple slides here that are really powerful that show a loss of lands. And when lands were lost, access to the land or the foods, the traditional foods, whether it be the source of water, the fertile crops, or the good land, the good dirt for growing crops, the places for gathering wild plants, a lot of that loss of land meant loss of access to traditional food. In this case, sadly, again, the Hidatsa, the Himanjan-Harekura, three affiliated nation, a dam was erected, they were not consulted, and 98% of their ag lands were taken. So this is all part of historical trauma, which does inform our health. Historical trauma ties into, it's connected to everything, including the food. So this is another image of California and tremendous loss of land, which means, again, loss of access to the salmon, their traditional gathering places, not just for food, but also for fiber, for their baskets, depletion of some of the traditional starches, the tule bulbs, and so very disruptive to the foodway. And this slide is just sharing knowledge that I regained from just interviewing. Elders are really our experts that we go to. Elders know what happened in the timeline, and this is the timeline I got from interviewing our Gray Eagles Society in Pine Ridge, and they described the end of the wagon era when cars started becoming more available. My friend Art Zimiga often talks about a ring of red and a loaf of white, and what he's talking about is when in the 60s, all of a sudden ring bologna and white bread became kind of like the thing. That's what replaced our soups. And it's like, oh, we don't have to cook. We have this, this fast convenience food. And then I've had elders tell me their experience of their very first soda that they drank. So you can see a big shift happening right there in the 60s. Well, that is right before we see diabetes starting to emerge. So all of these changes, I really believe, led to why diabetes started to really emerge. In my region, up in South Dakota, it was declared an epidemic in the 80s, but every tribe is different about that timeline. Some tribes received that declaration earlier than the 80s. So now today, all of us know that, the people we serve, our Native communities, have very high rates, the highest rates in the United States of any ethnic group with diabetes, and also, sadly, the comorbidities. We suffer kidney failure and many other cardiovascular disease and other comorbidities at higher rates than other ethnicities too. So the toll of diabetes has been very high in our communities. And so sometimes I like to kind of juxtaposition two different things in because it's kind of what we just witnessed. We were talking about our traditional foodway, and here I have a picture of my unchi. That's grandmother in Lakota. So my unchi, her name is Julia, was a soup person. I mean, we have many varieties of soups that we eat, and that was our core staple food. And so I'm kind of contrasting that with ramen. So it's real though, because our people might be eating more ramen than they do their traditional soups. And so how does that affect our health? How are they different? And obviously just looking at the image, you can see, oh, wow, one's got some colorful carrots, one's got some good broth and some meat, and the other one looks like it's just made out of bleached white flour, which it is. And it's an instant noodle. That's what ramen is, in a very salty broth. And it's really, it's not an equal replacement. And it's convenient, it's inexpensive, but our traditional soups are fairly inexpensive. So I guess, the difference is that convenience. It does take time to cook and prepare our traditional foods, but it's time that my Unchi thought was valuable. The time that she spent with food, I don't think she would want to have it any other way. So time with food does equate to nutrition. All right, so we're going to dive into some methods that I like to use for educating. So traditional learning traditionally is experiential. It's often transfer of knowledge from an elder to a younger person, and it's through storytelling. It's through seeing, tasting, touching, doing. It's experiential, and that's a natural way to learn, and that's often how my patients want to learn. I know a lot of times we, as dietitians, we have these diet instructions, and they're kind of like a 2 or 3 or 4 page document that's kind of wordy, and it kind of spells out everything. But, honestly, that's not something if I just hand it to my patient without doing all of the education and doing it really hands-on, they're not really going to learn from that and from just the diet instruction, very didactic form. And if you have an education, like maybe you have a master's degree or maybe you're well educated and you learn that way, but I find that our own people, our Lakota people, our Native people in general, learn by other methods. So we're going to dive into some of those. Okay, so human health is not easy, and so when I'm dealing with a patient and he's diabetic or she's diabetic, and we're talking about blood sugars, it's kind of abstract unless I can put an image to it. And so I love using imagery, and this is a wonderful image that's been around for a long time. Maybe some of you've seen this, but when we're talking about blood sugars, I often grab an image like this so we can see what happens inside the body. And my own words just don't capture it. So I think the picture captures it much better. And so, we dive into this when we're talking about, their own blood sugar. One on the left is showing the excess of sugar in the blood, and there's nowhere for the sugar to go. It's probably circulating. And that image on the left, you see a closed channel or gate for the sugar to enter. The cell obviously does not want the sugar. It's resisting. There's insulin present, but that cell is slamming that gate shut. And on the right side, we have an image where sugar is actually moving into the cell. Insulin's functioning and opening that, helping the cell to respond and receive the sugar. And so just images like this really make a difference. If somebody's got a high sugar, you can kind of show them, well, the sugar's there, but it's got nowhere to go. And that's really powerful to the patient. They can really relate to that. Okay, so I'm going to use a case study. I like just, take a real patient. Of course, we've changed her name. But, this is clinic, and many of you guys are clinicians that are listening. You see these scenarios, and we have a 51-year-old woman with a BMI of 41. She complains that she had a weight gain this past 2 years, about 25 pounds. She's got a family history of diabetes. She's not yet diabetic, but she feels so tired, too tired to even go out and do yard work for more than 5 minutes. She sleeps a lot, and she comes in using a walker because of weakness. We look at her blood work. We see that her protein is low, or mildly depleted, albumin at 3.0. Potassium slightly low. Triglycerides very, very high, and her A1C is 5.5. Her diet recall, very important that we learn how they're currently eating. Fried potatoes with chilies, fry bread, and Pepsi is her first meal of the day at 11. Hamburger on a bun, Pepsi, and fries for her lunch or late lunch, and then a late supper about 9 o'clock, and it's potato chips with ramen. She denies any knowledge of carbohydrates. So this is the scenario we face on a regular basis. She doesn't really know much about carbs, and that's obviously going to be the focus of our session, is to really help her understand how carbs are affecting her health. Well, first off, the slide I just opened, adult energy needs. She is 51. Okay, so when women are now in their 40 decade, okay, now they're in their 50 decade, we see a shift in energy expenditure. You can see that it's declining. We tend to see a declines in muscle mass starting at age 40, 1% per year. And so, perhaps she's eating similar to how she did. She might say, well, I'm eating the same I did 10 years ago, but her energy needs are decreased. So that's one thing I often address with a patient is their age. Earlier I had a patient who was 67 and today, and we do focus in on that because a lot of times their bodies change, but they haven't really changed their eating. Okay, and same with men, of course, it declines, but men generally have higher energy needs than women. So this kind of image here looks a little bit like the way she's eating. It's a lot of refined carbs. I actually took this photo at church. Some of the church ladies were doing lunch for the kids, and this is what was served. Refined carbs are inexpensive. You can run out to a store and buy them really easily. They don't require much preparation, but nutritionally they might leave you feeling empty. So this is a very high sugar refined carb meal. I don't see a whole lot of nutrition there. Okay, so what do we mean when we say refined or processed grains versus a whole grain? So a grain, as you see in the image with the wheat in the sky in the background, you've seen this growing, maybe going down the highway, a field of wheat. So if we just take that wheat and grind it up, the whole grain, all the fiber, the wheat germ, everything gets ground up, that's a whole grain. Maybe we turn it into a wheat thin or a whole wheat cracker. Great. But generally what we tend to see is a lot of times just the endosperm, which is the starchy part of the grain, is utilized. The rest of the fiber is removed. The wheat germ is removed. So really you're just capturing the starch and then it gets bleached. And so you can see how that is highly processed. You can see where, well, if they bleached it, they probably destroyed a few nutrients. So this is what we're dealing with, is a lot of the wheat that we get, if we're not careful, might be that enriched wheat. It might not say bleached, but if it's enriched, that means it is bleached. So instead, we want the whole grain. And traditionally, like we said, our carbohydrates were whole. Our corn was whole. So today that might mean brown rice is a whole grain. All the fiber is still there. It's not polished off like white rice. So maybe a buckwheat flour in the pancake. Whole grains in the morning like oatmeal, cornmeal, they go terrific with some fruit, some low-fat yogurt or milk. Or try a new grain. Maybe you try quinoa. Millet is actually becoming very popular. So try maybe wild rice, some other type of grain. Okay, when I teach carbohydrates, and this, I'm going to grab my pointer here, we really grab an image. So let's just, I'm circling this triangle here, and I'm going to underline the word carbohydrate, or I'm sorry, I can't do it now, but with the patient, I'm going to underline that word. Okay, so this is, they're kind of scared. They don't really understand carbohydrates. It's a big word. It's a chemistry word, and they don't really know if this is something they're ever going to understand. And so we're going to try to help them. It's really quite simple. If we just study this first little group here, and these are carbs, and I ask them, what do you see here? And this step is really important. I cannot go further until we get this step out of the way. And the patient's looking at me, and they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, what do you see? What do they look like? What color? And finally, they'll say, well, they look brown, or they look white. Okay, so whatever they say, they look pale. Okay, as long as they have an idea in their head, these carbs right here, they have a certain look. They all look similar. Okay, great. So they got that. Then we'll move on down to here. So we have a group. These happen to be starchy vegetables. They're more colorful. Okay, there's many colors of corn, many colors of beans, even different color potatoes. Sometimes the winter squash is colorful. So these are the traditional carbs from these lands. These are the carbs that was the foodway was based on corn, bean, potato, squash. And up here we have these really pale carbs. Well, they're all carbs. But we want to make sure that the patient is able to identify carbs. Now that we've looked at the color pattern, that's what informs being able to identify them. We'll go later into the types of carbs, but right now we're just kind of trying to get a visual so that we can start flipping through pictures and have them identify them. I drew a line over here, and so these are also carbs. This is fruit, and fruit is sweet. We can taste it. And that sweetness is sugar, and it is a carbohydrate. We're going to definitely encourage fruit and be included in their diet, particularly in the morning or in the daytime. I'm not a big fan of fruit late at night. I'm afraid that the sugar content might not get utilized. And so, so fruit is fantastic, but particularly in the daytime. We go into portions. So let's go on to the next slide here. Okay. Again, our starchy vegetables, which is our carbohydrate source originally, very, very colorful. Many of these have antioxidants from those bright colors. So another thing I guess I wanted to mention is the dietary guidelines for Americans does recommend starchy vegetables, and unfortunately in the American diet we really don't get enough starchy vegetables according to the dietary guidelines for Americans. And I hope you can see this slide. It's a little blurry, but it kind of just goes through a range of calorie levels and how much is recommended. And this one is, there's different examples in the dietary guidelines. I just took this from the Mediterranean style eating pattern. And you can see it's voluminous. It's cups of starchy vegetables per week, or red and orange vegetables like tomatoes and carrots. So very colorful, large volumes of colorful plants, both fruits and vegetables, based on the different calorie levels. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at a label at this stage. So we're talking about carbs, and I think it's very important because this is our primary fuel. We need to understand what powers our body, and that tends to be carbohydrate. Yes, fat is a fuel, but it's typically not our primary fuel. And so carbs are really important. They also break down to sugar. So, we really do want to understand what is it that our body runs on. Okay, when we do look at a label, the total carb matters. But 37, I see there's 4 grams of fiber. I'm going to go ahead and subtract the 4 just because I want to know how many of these carbs ultimately are going to break down to sugar. So I subtract that out. It's 33. And so, 33, whatever this product is, the serving size at the top, 2/3 of a cup, this product is about equal to 2 slices of bread. It's a high fiber product. It's probably a whole grain. They didn't really tell us what product this is. But we do know we're getting a pretty good source of carbohydrate, a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein. Okay. And then the amount of calories, of course, now that this is the new label, is nice and bold and very readable. Okay. Okay, let's take another look. So I should have mentioned that the image I'm using right here is used with permission from getvisuals.com, formerly known as Learning Zone Express. It's a visual that I really like and use it with my diabetic patients. It's also known as my diabetes plate. So at the bottom of the plate, again, I have that line that I drew. I'm going to grab my pointer and see if I can grab my pointer, if it'll let me do that. Where'd it go? Now it's not working. Oh, there it is. Okay, so we got that line. So down here we have low carb or non-starchy vegetables, very low carb, and then we have good sources of protein. And I often refer to these as low carb and no carb, just so that the patient understands that not every food is a carb. A lot of times they're surprised to learn, oh, you mean these are either low carb or no carb? Yes, but they are also consumed generally, if you're with a diabetic, they're going to be consumed with a carbohydrate. Okay. All right, so this is the fun part. This is where the patient gets to start identifying. I hope all of you use the My Native Plate. It's a wonderful tool. when I open this up and it's got the front and the back side, um, this is where they've told me, okay, those carbs are white or they're brown or they're pale or whatever they called it. Now I'll say, well, where's the carb? And almost always my patient, after they've really studied what carbs look like, they're able to identify, oh, there's the carb, and then often they'll go to the fruit and acknowledge that as a carb too. So once they do that and they get them sequentially, usually it's just 1, 2, 3. They identify them really quickly. Now they have confidence that they can do this, and these are often patients that have never been able to identify carbs in the past. So we see a carb. We need a carb. Many of these patients are on diabetic medications. We want to balance the carbs throughout the day, and so now they're identifying carbs, and they're including them, but in moderation. We go into the quantity of the carb, of course, the type of carb. And then another fun trick I do is we hide. I wish I could do it here, but let's say I just covered this up with a sheet of paper right over here. And all they can see is the tortilla and the egg. And I'll say, well, where's the color? And so that's my code for, we just have a starch protein. Same thing over here. If we covered up the vegetable, we just have a starch protein. There's no color. They're going to notice right away they want the color. So the color is the micronutrients. That's where a lot of our vitamins, antioxidants, potassium, and so very important to kind of play with this and play with the color, because the carb this side you don't really see much color. The starch protein is typically not very colorful. Okay, so variety is the word in nutrition. If you can't remember much about nutrition, just remember variety. You need to mix things up. You need to vary your protein. Plant-based proteins are fantastic. We're doing a lot more plant-based eating. A lot of people are really seeing the value, both ecologically and nutritionally. Seafood twice a week. Definitely the American Heart Association still has that recommendation that we need to include seafood for heart health. Leaner cuts of meat, slow-cooked ones. I really encourage crock pots and things to slow cook to make that meat tender. Okay. And then, oops, I thought that one would pop in. I guess it didn't. Part of this image, it was going to. But anyway, half your plate. You've seen my plate with half your plate with color. I use the word color. That's my patients get used to it. When I say I need color on your plate, they know I'm talking about a fruit or veg. That's where the bright colors are going to be. And of course, they need that, especially as we get older. Antioxidants are so vital to your health. So here, for antioxidants, brightly colored foods, whether you have tomatoes or berries or beets or those bright color pigments are often antioxidants. So the lycopene in the tomato, the berries have anthocyanin, beta-carotene in all the orange-colored foods like carrots and cantaloupe. Those are really powerful chemistry that help your cells defend against oxidative damage. A mouthful, but sometimes you can find a nice simplified handout on antioxidants, but I do bring that up in discussion with my patients. Okay, the new food label, and then we'll just have hopefully a few more slides. We'll have time for questions. Okay, many of you are probably aware the food label was changed to make it more readable. Like we said before, that you can see the calories, a nice big bold. You can see the serving size without trying to search for it. Now they have added sugars, very important because added sugars are a big threat to our health when we get huge excesses that we tend to see in clinic where patients are almost like sugar addicted. Okay. All right, so another thing to look at on the label is we mentioned fiber, and I know I know not all dietitians do that, but I personally like to subtract the fiber from the total because we want to find out how many of those grams of carb are going to break down to sugar, and fiber does not break down to sugar, so we subtract it. Vitamin D, very important, calcium, potassium, very important to see those. And what we want less of. We want less saturated fat and trans fat. Unfortunately, trans fats have really been on the decline since they've been banned. Um, Sodium and added sugars, those are the ones we really don't want to be seeing, but we should need to check. Sometimes you don't know unless you look. Okay, so getting back to a theme from our traditions, we talked about the soups. Boiling, roasting, baking, and drying, those were some of the main food cooking or preparation methods. And the things that we see today, like fry bread, popovers, cake, those sometimes people might think of them as traditional, but obviously they're really not traditional. I often have a little cask of, or little, like a mason jar of flour, bleached flour, and I explained to my patients that this is what our people were given when we gave up our lands. They put it in our treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty, they're going to issue us flour, and they did. And when the Lakotas received it, they were so insulted, they took their knife and they cut the sack of flour open and they just dumped it. So it was not a food they could eat. They never had bread before. And so, you know, that's really a food that I wish we still I wish we still didn't eat. But we have to often remind people that that is not really traditional. Okay, sugar. We'll touch a little bit on this. This is a wonderful little poster from the Great Plains Travel Chairman's Health Board, but it is a big threat. I really see sugar as a huge threat to our health as Native people because I really think we're very sensitive to large amounts of it, and we really got to protect our children from being addicted. Here's a little image of a kid sipping on a soda, but the sugar from beverages takes up half of the sugars that people are consuming is coming from what they're drinking. And the thing is, you can drink, 70 grams of sugar just from one soda, and that's a huge amount of sugar hitting your bloodstream. Very, very risky. So we want to really promote water and get our, especially with the kids, we have to, help our children have access to healthy beverages, and of course promote breastfeeding. Explain the difference between natural sugar and added sugar. Added sugar is really what we're targeting. I do want to put a shout out here for the FDPR, the FDPR program, distribution program in Indian reservations, and as a source of access to food, real food, food that we cook. Cooking real food, so vital because that is what we've always had. We've always prepared our own foods. We didn't have frozen pizzas, and we want to promote the FDPR as an option. It's a very large food package. Families that receive this food package are less food insecure. And I also want to just put a shout out for our traditional education materials. Hopefully you have, this is just one that I worked on with the Great Plains. It uses the medicine wheel, which is a tool that I first launched for nutrition in 2001. But I think we all can come up with, tools that are specific to a tribe or a region that really put in, just promote our foodway as we can follow it in a modern time. Okay, just a couple more slides, and then I'll open it up for questions. Since it is National Nutrition Month, the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics has some wonderful toolkit. I encourage all the dietitians or anybody to go to eatright.org and look at the resources in the toolkit. They're wonderful. And so a variety of healthy foods. We need to hydrate healthfully with low sugar beverages. We need to read food facts, nutrition facts labels, and practice portion control. Cooking, I really think cooking is something we always need to promote. Think of our mothers and our grandmothers, how much cooking they did. Keep healthy ingredients on hand. practice food safety, share meals together as a family when possible, and try new flavors and foods. And then access, we have to plan our meals. We need to, make sure we're shopping to get access to foods. Try new recipes. Eat healthy at school and work, which also requires planning. And when we travel. And I guess a closing thought is, as a